That's a clown question, bro.
So I'm gonna kick some dirt.
He gets on base.
Just a bit outside.
I'm not the type of player that's going to be Johnny Hustle.
If you don't want me to watch the ball, you can go get it out of the ocean.
And welcome to Above Replacement Radio. We're talking baseball kind of whenever. I'm your host, Chris Chianta. Over there on the other side of the screen is Daniel Curran. How you doing, Daniel?
Chris, this is a first in the history series. We have a guest on this episode.
Yes, we do. Yeah, one of our journalism professors from Springfield College taught our intro to journalism class, and biggest Tom Seaver fan we know. And you know, I'm sure there's some maybe Springfield alumni that might be interested in this interview. If you just want to get to the interview,
current students.
Current students as well. If you want to get to that interview, that's the timestamp is in the description for anyone just interested in that, because I know there's a lot of Springfield College people that might be interested in that. But anyway, yeah, we're talking about Tom Seaver, who was the greatest pitcher of his era and the greatest Met of all time. And yeah, we're going to get into his life and career, starting with how he grew up.
So Tom Seaver was born in Fresno, California under the name George Thomas Seaver. Obviously, he ended up going by his middle name. And he started Little League at the age of 9, like most people, probably a little early, in fact. And within 3 years, he pitched a perfect game in that league. So he was perfect on the mound before he could even get to the majors, and before he could even get scouts at his games, in fact. He was doing it just for fun, throwing perfect games. And later on, he pitched for Fresno High School, which had already produced some successful major league talent with Jim Maloney, who had a 37.5 B WAR, and Dick Ellsworth with a 20.1 B WAR. And he made an impression on another future MLB pitcher who was high school teammates with Seaver, who was Dick Selma, who said, quote, "Even in high school, Tom was a thinking pitcher. Even in high school, Tom was a thinking pitcher," remembered Selma. Selma was a later teammate of Seaver's on the Mets, and he also said, quote, "He knew how to set up a hitter by working on the corners of the plate, and the batter would usually pop the ball for an easy out." And after graduating high school, he registered at Fresno City College, and he played baseball there.
And now we get into what his college life was, because it's kind of interesting in how Tom Seaver ended up. His route to professional baseball was a pretty interesting one. So Seaver was at Fresno City College, and while he was at Fresno City College, he put in time in the Marines. And in his second year at Fresno City College, he won 11 consecutive games and set numerous strikeout records for that particular college. And this caught the attention of many professional and college scouts, as you know, it obviously would. He's, you know, setting school records for such a, you know, at such a high level. And Rod Dedeaux, I believe is how it's pronounced, the head coach of University of Southern California, who had won the NCAA championship in 1958, 1961, and 1965, asked Tom Seaver to join the Trojans for his junior year. And in order for Seaver to earn that scholarship at USC, he played a season of semi-professional baseball in Alaska. And I guess, you know, he was able to make enough of an impression. You know, I don't know how the word would get back from Alaska, how he actually did, but he ended up doing just fine. So in Tom Seaver's junior year, he was at USC, and at USC, he was still spectacular. He went 10-2 with a 2.47 ERA and 100 strikeouts in 100 innings pitched. And after the season, he was drafted in the 10th round of the first ever MLB draft of 1965 by the Los Angeles Dodgers. This is our third history alumni that we've talked about who was drafted in the first ever draft. And Seaver asked for a $50,000 signing bonus from the Dodgers, and that is something that they were not willing to give at the time. And the MLB, because this was sort of the infancy stage of the amateur draft, the MLB added a secondary phase to the draft in January, which was made for players who were drafted in the summer but did not sign, like what Seaver did with the Dodgers. So ultimately, in that second phase, Seaver was drafted by the Atlanta Braves, which was a team that he liked. He grew up liking Hank Aaron and also Eddie Matthews, who is a history alum, Above Replacement Radio history alum. And Seaver actually ended up signing with the Braves in late February. But unfortunately for the Braves, USC had already played a handful of games for their 1966 season before they signed Seaver, and teams could not sign a high school or college player after their high school or college season had begun. So in March, Seaver's contract, because of this rule, Seaver's contract with the Braves was voided by MLB Commissioner William Eckert. So with the Braves unable to sign him, the MLB put together a lottery that included teams that would match the Braves' contract offer for Tom Seaver. And those teams ended up being the Cleveland Indians, Philadelphia Phillies, and the New York Mets. And the Mets ended up winning that lottery for Tom Seaver's rights. And that put Tom Seaver into the New York Mets organization.
So, by a random number generator, Tom Seaver is now in the New York Mets minor league system. And in 1966, he was in AAA, putting up a 3.13 ERA, 8.1 strikeouts per nine, and 2.8 walks per nine in 210 innings pitched. And Jacksonville manager Solly Hemus was overwhelmed by his pupil's talent and poise, insisting that his, quote, 35-year-old head attached to a 21-year-old's body was ready for prime time. And Earl Weaver, while managing the Orioles affiliate in Rochester, agreed with Hemus from the visiting dugout, where he said, quote, "It was apparent in Tom Seaver's pro debut that he was ready for the majors. He had an excellent fastball and slider, and he put them precisely where he wanted to, in and out on the black of the plate, mostly knee high. After Jacksonville beat us, I phoned the then general manager, Harry Dalton, and said that Seaver was going to be sensational and the Orioles could give up a piece of the franchise and do well to get him." So he's already, got GMs on the phone about him. And after spring training of 1967, Seaver was added to the Mets MLB roster.
So a quick road to the majors from the minors for Tom Seaver. Only 1 year of minor league play required, which makes sense because of not only Seaver's skill, but also where the Mets were as a franchise at this time. So to title the first 2 years of his career, it's sort of the first era of Tom Seaver. Seaver's the immediate face of the franchise. You can tell with this rookie season that he is already the best player in their brief history. So Seaver made his MLB debut on April 13th, 1967. That is where he threw 5 1/3 innings pitched, allowed 2 runs, and struck out 8 in a no decision. And in his third start, he threw 10 innings, allowed 1 run that was unearned, and allowed 4 hits and struck out 5 and got the win. And it is one of 2 starts in the history of game logs within a pitcher's first 3 career games with 10 plus innings pitched, less than 5 hits allowed, no earned runs allowed, and 5 plus strikeouts. The other start was by Dick Selma, Seaver's Fresno High teammate, and at this point, Mets teammate. This was the guy that we quoted earlier in the episode, who was talking about Seaver. So pretty ironic that this was able to happen.
That is a how about that on multiple levels.
Yeah, exactly. Like, Usually I never say it is one of two starts, but when I saw Dick Selma was the other guy, it's like, oh my God, this was
A full circle.
This is pretty crazy. And like, yeah, it's
We've,
not even
we've
just a
come full
random...
circle, and it's 5 minutes into the episode.
Exactly. Yeah, we could end it right now if we wanted to.
But we're not.
We're not going to do that. We only have about 115 minutes left.
Yeah.
With this episode. So throughout the first half, Tom Seaver put up a 2.65 ERA in 129 total innings pitched, and he earned a spot on the National League All-Star roster. And when the National League took the lead in the top of the 15th, Seaver pitched a scoreless bottom of the 15th and earned the save. So immediately, he was making an impact for his league, not only his team. And he ended up with a 2.76 ERA, 3.16 FIP, and 122 ERA plus in 251 innings pitched in that year of 1967. And he finished 8th in innings pitched and 9th in ERA plus. He also finished 5th in BWAR. And Seaver ended up winning Rookie of the Year, and he finished 22nd in the MVP vote. And Seaver's 1967 had 40% more BWAR than the next best season by a Mets player up to this point in the franchise's history. And it is the only season by a pitcher in their first season with 250 plus innings pitched, 170 plus strikeouts, and less than 225 hits allowed.
How about that?
And you could tell why he was so far above and beyond anyone else's Mets season. The Mets were just not good at all. The Mets went 61 and 101 and finished last in the National League in 1967.
So now we head into 1968, which of course we all know was the year of the pitcher, and Tom Seaver did his part. He finished 5th in innings pitched with a 278, 4th in fielding independent pitching with a 222, 7th in ERA with a 2.20, and 5th in ERA plus with a 137. So this guy, his second season in the majors, the year of the pitcher, what does he do? He puts up an ERA plus above 135. That is very impressive. 2nd in BWAR and 4th in FWAR. I think I can probably guess who we lost to in BWAR that year.
Yeah, National League pitcher, probably a guy like in the Central or something, or I guess
yeah. Well, there was no Central back then.
Yeah, but if it was,
but today, yeah. Like the geographically speaking, yeah,
like
the Midwest. Yeah. Robert Gibson or something like that.
I think it was old Bobby G or something like that.
Yeah, one of those guys. And Tom Seaver put up the only season by a pitcher in their first 2 seasons in the modern era, that is since 1900, with 270 plus innings pitched and a 4+ K to walk ratio. This was also the only season by a pitcher in their first 2 seasons with 270 plus innings pitched, 6.64 plus strikeouts per 9, and less than 1.6 walks per 9. And lastly, it is the only season by a pitcher in their first 2 seasons with 200 plus strikeouts, less than 50 walks, and 5+ shutouts. So Seaver was doing his part, but as for the Mets, they weren't following his lead. They went 73 and 89 and finished 9th in the National League.
And now we head into 1969. We'll give our lay perspective of it first, and then we'll introduce the audience to Mr. Marty Dobrow. So the story of 1969 with Tom Seaver, it definitely started at the beginning, and we'll get into that with the Marty Dobrow guest segment. But on July 9th, Tom Seaver had retired his first 25 batters.
Almost perfect. His speed and control are brilliant. Ernie Banks is just one victim of his 11 strikeouts. He gets flawless support from his teammates before 59,083 fans, a record turnout in Shea Stadium. When he strikes out Al Spangler, he's pitched 8 full innings of scoreless, hitless baseball. Nancy Seaver holds back her emotions as a huge crowd watches every pitch. The first Cub up in the 9th. Randy Hutley tries a spoiling bunt, but Seaver throws him out. 2 outs to go to a perfect game. Jim Qualls, a rookie outfielder, is up. A clean hit to left center field, and there goes the perfect game. But there's a standing ovation for Seaver by 59,000 fans. It's still a near-perfect game when Don Kessinger flies out to end it. And it's a vital victory for the Mets. Back-to-back wins shake up the Cubs.
Tom Seaver comes very close to getting a perfect game. Definitely the first one in Mets history, but falls just short, but, gets the win and the shutout. And Tom Seaver heading into an August 31st doubleheader, the Mets were 75-53 and were 4 games back of those Cubs for the National League East lead. Note this is also the first year of the divisional era where there's divisions now. And from that point forward, from that August 31st doubleheader on, Seaver started 7 games, completed all of them, won all of them, shut out the opponent in 3 of them, and allowed a total of 5 runs in 63 innings pitched, with none of those runs coming off of a home run. And the Mets in this span went 25-9 and ended up winning the National League East with a 162 record. They went from 73 wins to 100. And Seaver ended up with a 2.21 ERA, 3.11 FIP, and 165 ERA plus in 273 and a third innings pitched. And he finished 4th in ERA and 2nd in ERA plus. And Seaver led the league in wins with 25. He finished 5th in B-WAR, but, because of those wins with that 25-7 record on the winning Mets, Tom Seaver won the Cy Young. And also Seaver tied Willie McCovey with 11 first place MVP votes, which were the, most of that year. And he, unfortunately for him, ended up with 22 less total vote points and finished 2nd in the MVP vote. And Seaver, with his 67, 68, and 69, Seaver remains the only pitcher in the live ball era to have 6+ B-WAR in each of his first 3 seasons. So now the Mets are officially in the postseason for their first time ever. So in the first game in NLCS history, Tom Seaver was going at it against Phil Niekro, and he allowed 5 runs. Seaver allowed 5 runs in 7 innings, but he ended up getting the win as the Mets offense picked him up, and they get a 9-5 victory over the Braves. And the Mets went on to sweep the Braves. So then in game 1 of the World Series, Seaver allowed 4 runs in 5 innings and ended up getting the loss in a 4-1 defeat to the Orioles. And the Mets, to the surprise of many, won games 2 and 3 of that series, putting them ahead 2-1. And in game 4, Seaver shut out the Orioles for the first inning, then allowed 2 singles and a game-tying sacrifice fly in the 9th inning. So it was a 1-1 game now. So the game went into extras, and Tom Seaver continued pitching, and the leadoff hitter of the 10th reached on an error from the third baseman. After the next hitter popped out, the third batter singled, and the fourth batter flew out and moved a runner from second to third. And that left runners on the corners and 2 outs in a 1-1 game in the top of the 10th.
1-2 delivery. Breaking pitch struck him out. So we'll be going to the bottom of the 10th. Strikeout number 6 for Seaver. No runs, 2 hits, no errors, 2 left. In the middle of the 10th inning, the score is the New York Mets 1, the Baltimore Orioles 1.
So Tom Seaver gets out of that jam and gives his team a better chance at winning the game in the bottom of the inning. And the Mets ended up walking it off in the bottom of the 10th. And the next day, or the next game, not sure if it was next day, they won Game 5, making Tom Seaver a World Series champion. And that is where we hand over the keys to Mr. Marty Dobrow, our segment with Mr. Marty Dobrow. And we are here with our 6th ever guest of Above Replacement Radio, first ever guest under the new name Above Replacement Radio. We're here with our journalism professor and the biggest Tom Seaver fan we know, Mr. Marty Dobrow. Marty, how are you doing?
Doing great, Chris, Daniel. Thank you guys so much for joining me. I love what you guys are doing on this podcast. Love the name. And obviously the passion for our greatest game is something we all share. So great to be here.
So we'll get right into the Tom Seaver talk, and I'm not that familiar with the, I guess, Mets fandom of yours growing up. So like, what are your earliest memories of the Mets? Because I imagine that as Seaver was coming up, that was kind of the time you were getting into baseball. So, and Seaver was, you could tell like in his rookie year, just looking back at it, he was the first great Met. And it was pretty clear. It was pretty clear that was happening like in his rookie year. So was he kind of just like a diamond in the rough for the Mets even early on?
Yeah, he was the find. He was the franchise. He was the guy who turned the Mets from kind of lovable losers into champions and into, I think, one of the great stories in baseball history, because the history of the Mets, the Brooklyn Dodgers left for Los Angeles, the New York Giants left for San Francisco, and suddenly New York, which had been 3 teams with the Yankees, of course, was down to just one. For a few years. And then in 1962, the Mets launched their franchise. I don't remember that. I was born in December of 1960, but I know of the history, and the history is that in 62, they were, a historically terrible team. I think they did not play the full 162. There were 2 games that were rained out and not made up, if I'm correct. I think there were 40 and 120. Comically bad. All sorts of crazy things happened, like the first run ever scored against the Mets in the first game was on a balk when the pitcher dropped the ball in the middle of his motion, and then it just kind of went down from there. I mean, they were just terrible, terrible baseball. And so, as I'm growing up and just beginning to get into it, I think I went to my first game. I have a ticket stub from 65, so I would have been 4 years old. Don't really remember that. But I do remember Seaver's rookie year, which was 67. And the Mets were still terrible. They'd been in last place every single year. There was not divisional play yet in Major League Baseball. So it was in the National League, they had expanded in 62 with the Mets and the Astros, who were then known as the Houston Colt 45s. And but in 67, Seaver came to the Mets, and he had initially been drafted by somebody else. I think it was the Braves. There was some weird thing in the contract so there was a lottery system, like 3 teams put in. They pulled the Mets name out of the hat, and pretty instantly, the Mets had this player who was this fierce competitor, this vibrant personality, someone who just had a real high expectation of winning. And So even though the team was still bad and still finished in last place yet again, I think he was like 16-13 or something like that his first year. And with a good ERA and high strikeout total. And, suddenly there was some reason to believe. And then he had another excellent similar year in 68. And then, of course, 69 was the year, the Miracle Mets year. So that's a year that coincided with my journey kind of perfectly, because I was really getting into baseball. I was 8 years old that year. It was my first year of Little League. I was a pitcher. I was a right-handed pitcher. And here was this guy who was a right-handed pitcher. I grew up on Long Island and not far, got to go to some of those games, went to the first game of the 69 season, opening day. Mets played against the Montreal Expos, an expansion team. It's the first year of divisional players, just two divisions, National League East and National League West. And the Mets had what should have been a gimme of a game again, first game ever against the Expos. They got Seaver on the mound. He gives up a couple runs in the first inning, doesn't pitch well. And the Mets wind up losing on opening day in the first ever game for the Expos, 11-10. And it certainly doesn't seem like that's going to be a year, but it wound up being a year for the ages. Happy to talk more about it if you guys want to hear more about 69. It's pretty, I remember some of those games with unbelievable vividness, even though they've now happened over 50 years ago.
Yeah, actually, one thing I'd probably like to get into is, they were facing, when they went into the World Series, they were facing the Orioles, who, the Mets had an impressive record of 162. The Orioles, meanwhile, had 109 wins in that series. So, and I actually watched some of the pregame for Game 4 of the World Series. It's on YouTube, and they were talking about how the Orioles were like heavy favorites. So, was there a lot of doubt, like, coming into that series from, a Mets perspective?
So I will answer that question. It's a good question, but let me just rewind the tape, since we've gone, from opening day right now to the World Series. And there's obviously a whole journey of a season. And I'll just try to condense that into a few highlights and then bring you to the World Series. So the Mets, as you say, they won 100 games that year, which was staggering because they'd always been a terrible team. As I mentioned, they had finished in last place 62, 63, 64, 65, 66, 67. And then I think in 68, which was the last year of no divisional play, the Mets surged all the way from 10th place in a 10-team league to 9th place, right? So they'd never come close to a winning record. And here they go into 69, and suddenly they win 100 games. And Seaver wins 25 of those games. And there's some of those games are just absolutely, as I said, indelible in my mind. There's what's known as the almost perfect game or the imperfect game. I think it was July 8th or 9th, 69. I remember it was an evening game against the Cubs, who were then the top team in the Cubs, oddly, were in the National League East. And they were the favorites. They had some really terrific players. They were in first place for most of the year, but the Mets began making up some ground. And in this game in July, Seaver was pitching against the Cubs. And I was able to negotiate with my parents, staying up late that night and watch the game. And he was just mowing people down, 1, 2, 3 in the first, in the second, in the third, in the fourth, on and it's going. And just like hopping fastball, big cutting curveball, Mets surging ahead. It's just, and goes on, perfect game through 5 innings, through 6, through 7, through 8, 24 up, 24 down, and it's going to the 9th inning, and my little 8-year-old heart is hammering away. And the 9th inning begins. I think Randy Hundley led off, if I remember correctly. He was the catcher. There have been subsequent Hundleys, as you probably know, who've been catchers. I think he was the first. And he got him out, I forget how, but so it's now 2 outs to go. And up to the plate steps a light-hitting outfielder by the name of Jimmy Qualls, Qualls. And you can look him up in terms of his major league career. He had something like 41 major league hits. very forgettable career.
It's a very memorable number of hits. Tom Seaver, 41.
Yeah, I think it might have been. Maybe I'm conflating it, but it's somewhere about that. You can.
I'm looking it up right now.
All right, let me know what the total is when you find
Jim
it.
Qualls, yeah, there he is. Played for the Cubs, had 31 career hits.
31.
30 of them were in the 1969 season, where he had a 608 OPS for a 61 OPS plus. So well below average hitter.
Well below average hitter, and Seaver is just, on cruise control. But one of those hits, one of those 31 career hits, left-handed batter, he hits this line drive the other way to left center field. Cleon Jones from left field converging one way, Tommy Agee from center field converging the other way, and the ball landing on the soft green outfield. And as it fell, so fell my little heart, because it was just devastating. And he, that was the only guy to reach base, and they won the game. I think it was like 6-0. And it just goes on. I mean, amazing things happen. The Mets wound up clinching the division title on September 24th. I mean, it's ridiculous, my recall for this, because I couldn't tell you, what I had for lunch yesterday. But September 24th, they play against the Cardinals. They win 6-0. Seaver doesn't pitch that day. Gary Gentry, a rookie, pitches. But my dad got tickets to that game as well, and my dad, still alive, and has always been this sort of like real, button up, button down, whatever the phrase is, buy the books sort of guy. But he really kind of got into it. He was an old Brooklyn Dodgers fan, and he allowed me, as an 8-year-old kid, to join the celebration on the field after that they clinched the division. And so right near that mound where you see Tom Seaver in your background, there were all these clumps of turf, and I grabbed one of them, and it was sat in moldering in a paper bag in my room for many years to come. Just great. They went into the playoffs against the Braves. Weirdly, the Braves were in the National League West. I don't know how they were thinking the geography there, but that was the Braves of the great Henry Aaron, who just passed away, and who was Tom Seaver's all-time hero actually growing up. And the Mets won that series, and they go up, to bring you in long-winded Dobrow fashion to your question, Chris. Here we are, the World Series against the Baltimore Orioles. Now we think of, modern fans think of the Orioles as an afterthought, not a team that has mostly not been good for the last 20 years or so, had a brief stretch. But they were mighty powerful team back then. They had a great starting pitching, some Frank Robinson and Brooks Robinson and Boog Powell, and local guy from Pittsfield, Mass, as their shortstop, Mark Belanger, and wasn't much of a hitter but very good shortstop. They were a great team and heavy favorites. And in the first game of the World Series, Seaver pitched and lost, and the Orioles won that game. And then the Mets came back and won game 2 and won game 3, and then this brings us to the YouTube that you watched, Chris, and I have to see this. I didn't know that this existed. The pregame for Game 4, you say, is on YouTube?
Yeah, it was funny because 2 players that we've covered on the series were analysts, Sandy Koufax and Mickey Mantle.
Yeah,
it was NBC Sports, where they were talking about how like they were saying, like, oh, the Orioles won game 1, and we expected this after beating Seaver. This would be a pretty easy series for the Orioles, but here we are 2 days later, and the Mets are ahead, not behind Seaver, but behind, I believe, Jerry Kuzman and Gary Gentry, and Nolan Ryan came in for like a 7-out save at a point, who we've also covered.
Yeah.
But it was kind of shocking to the baseball world, to put it that way.
Yeah, it was. I mean, it just was like this absurd year of, you think about what's like going on in 1969. I mean, it's just like all of this tumultuous stuff around Vietnam, and we're into the first year of the Nixon presidency, and there's social unrest, and there's Woodstock, drug culture. I mean, there's all of this stuff that's just kind of, all this turmoil in the country. But in the midst of all this, the Mets, the lovable, always terrible Mets just became this great story, and they just kept winning against all odds. And so on some level, we just sort of expected them to somehow keep that going. And so here, after that first loss, they won the next 2 games, and that brings us to Game 4. Now, again, I have a very personal story about Game 4 because it's a game that I remember probably as well as any baseball game in my memory. And there are several baseball games in my memory, but that was, I probably got in 1969, I maybe went to about, I don't know, 6 or 7 games. I mean, we went to that opening day game when they lost to the Expos. I went to the September 24th game when I got the clump of sod. Maybe 2 or 3 other regular season games. My dad, God love him, somehow, back then, and maybe tickets were a little more accessible, but he was able to get tickets to Game 4 of 1969. And we have now time for a visual aid.
Oh,
I don't know that this is a visual podcast or not, but
We are on
here
YouTube.
have a collage that you see part of, made by my mother and myself, about the Mets 69 season when I was 8 years old. And you can probably see, it's not in good focus, but those 2 World Series tickets there with Mr. Met on them.
oh yeah.
And if I were to read to you the, let's see what we can find out. Section 38, row V. I want to just take this over. I'm going to disappear from the screen for a second. I want to see if I can find the price of these tickets. So it's just going to be laughably low. But I have to put this under the light.
Chris, what's the over-under?
Over-under for the price of tickets, Section 38. I'm going to say
We're terrible at over-unders, by the way.
$5.99.
That's a pretty good guess.
Okay.
$8.
$8.
Wow. Wow.
And so row V, Section 38, what does that mean? That means the very, very top row of the stadium, with a better view of Flushing Bay than of what's happening at the field. Binoculars, but what a thrill to be there. And Tom Seaver pitching against the Orioles. And my dad has always had this theory, and it's I think it's an interesting theory, that Game 4 is always the most important game in a 7-game series. That, if it's 3-0, obviously it's a chance to close it out. If it's 2-1, it's either going to give the team that's behind momentum and make it a 3-game series, or it's going to give a pretty decisive advantage to the team with a 2-1 lead. I don't know. You could make arguments for Game 1, for any game. They're all important. But this game was this really taut, tight, tense game. And Seaver was on his game, was pitching brilliantly. 57,000 fans was the largest crowd I'd ever seen, largest mass of humanity I'd ever encountered. And the Mets were ahead, I believe it was 1-0, going, I think, to the 9th.
Yeah, it was the top of the 9th.
Top of the 9th. And Seaver's still in. And there is, they get, I think the situation is like runners on maybe 1st and 3rd, and you'll have to check the details.
First and are you talking about
the Brooks
a
Robinson?
Very good play in right field?
By Ron Swoboda, exactly.
Yeah.
So I think you can check it. I mean, you guys have the access to call this up, but what I'm remembering is, maybe inaccurately, 1st and 3rd, 1 out. Maybe there's nobody out. But the Orioles are really threatening, and it's like very tense. And Brooks Robinson, great player, known for his amazing defense at third base, which was just phenomenal, but also a really good hitter. And he hits this screaming line drive out to right center field. And from where I'm sitting, I have a good perspective on this. I mean, this ball just seems, this is splitting the outfielders, and it's going to roll to the wall. This is a triple in all likelihood. And Ron Swoboda Rocky Ron Swoboda, not a tremendously successful player in his career, but a longtime Met, gets this unbelievable jump on the ball. I mean, he just reads it off the bat perfectly and is just sprinting out towards the right center field gap. And he does this headlong dive, backhand at full extension. I believe that under the the catch itself has got to be one of the greatest catches in World Series history. I know we've got the famous Willie Mays, Vic Wertz over his shoulder catch. I mean, a number of amazing catches. I think this one is right there with any of them. And under the circumstances, it was just staggering, because if that ball gets through with him diving, especially with him diving, I think we're at least a triple, maybe an inside the park home run. Triple makes it a 2-1 game. Orioles, in all likelihood, winning that game. And then we know that we have to go back to the Mets are going to have to go back to Baltimore. The momentum turns. Somehow he comes up with this ball, comes up throwing to the plate. No chance, but he got, sacrifice fly, ties the game. Just staggering. And then in the 10th inning of the game, the Mets have, I believe it's a runner on second base. Again, you'll have to check the details, but I think they might have pinch hit for Seaver in the bottom of the 10th. I don't think there were any relief pitchers. I think Seaver went the whole way.
They did not. And
so he did pitch a full 10 innings?
10 innings. Yeah. He pulled the Jack Morris.
Yeah, pulled the Jack Morris. It's good reference. So the Mets have the runner on second base. I think they put in a pinch runner. I think it was Rod Gaspar. And up to the plate steps it might have been the pinch hitter for Seaver. I believe it was J.C. Martin.
That is correct.
Okay. And so J.C. Martin was this light-hitting, left-handed hitting catcher. Joseph Clifton Martin, I think it stands for. And he, with a runner on second base and nobody out, old school baseball, light hitter, he is trying to bunt him to third base. And, a play that maybe today we would not see, but then we did see it. And the pitcher for the Orioles was a left-hander, Pete Rickert. Jumped on the ball. It was a really good bunt. Runner's going to get to third base. And Rickert swivels and throws. And all of a sudden, I see the ball caroming out to right field. And Rod Gaspar, I believe it was Rod Gaspar, coming around the plate to score, going absolutely, I'm a mile from the plate, but I'm just so excited. And so the Mets win 2-1 and are up 3-1. And it's a long time down the escalators and, one game away from winning the World Series and 8 years old and anything seems possible. My first year of Little League. And surely my fate is that I am going to one day be on the mound at Shea Stadium myself. I'm not going to wind up being a professor at Springfield College. I mean, we know what's happening, right? So this is just destiny. And I am in the car with my father and we're listening to the post game. And back then, replay was, you didn't have like every pitch could be replayed. But they were looking at the replay of that. And the replay showed pretty clearly that J.C. Martin was out of the baseline, was running inside that 45-foot line, was on the grass, and was, the angle that Pete Rickert had to throw the ball to first base was really restricted. And they could very easily and probably should have called interference. And so the announcers, even though they were Mets announcers, were just saying that they really caught a major break here. And I am thinking in my mind to, 8 years old, like I've just seen the greatest game for me. And I'm just asking my father probably 30 separate times in different ways, are they going to have to replay the game? Are they going to take it back? Is it going to be overruled? They're just so disturbed that this precious thing might be taken away. But of course, that was not the case. And the Mets prevailed in that game and then prevailed the next game, game 5 behind Jerry Koosman, and won the World Series. And So let's now complete the sequence of this amazing sort of 69 Seaver story. And so we'll go back to our visual aid of the this collage. Okay. So here's the collage. And, it's not, I'm sorry, I'm in kind of a darker room, so you can't see this really well, but I'm in third grade a few weeks later, and the Mets are cashing in, they're celebrities. This is an unbelievable win, just a staggering achievement. Everybody's darlings. And in the 1969 version of this, they were, everybody wanted to give them, have them appear at various events. And Tom Seaver became a pitchman for this product called Braggi, B-R-A-G-G-I, cologne. So there I am at 8 years old, and I'm suddenly like a big fan of cologne, right? Not Bartolo cologne, but Braggi cologne. And so, like, what is this? Why is this a deal? But the deal is that the Seaver had a few promotional events that he did for, to get whatever money Braggi cologne was paying him. And one of them was to do this appearance at this local, what was called a department store. We don't have those around very much anymore. There used to be a lot, like big clothing stores mostly. And there was one called Abraham and Strauss in Manhasset, New York, which is the next town over from where I grew up, right near where Paul Tifo grew up as well. And we read that Tom Seaver is going to be at A&S. And I'm in third grade, and my mother, earning first ballot induction in the Mother's Hall of Fame, says,
unanimous.
Okay, I will pull you out of school early so you can go meet your hero. Pretty cool. Yes?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. So, to my joy and to the considerable consternation and envy of my third grade classmates, I go marching out of school early because this thing was happening at like 1 o'clock or something. And we get there. I insisted to my mother that we wanted to be there early. And we got there early. And there was this line. I have no idea how many people, but it's probably a few hundred people. I was the very first person online. I was so excited. And we're waiting. And then suddenly there he was. It was Tom Seaver. And I had brought with me this collage. And I didn't want to relinquish. I wanted to be there. I was ready to hang out there talking to Tom Seaver for like 20 hours if I could. But of course, I probably had a minute. And I hope we can see this, all these years later. But if you see carefully, there is some writing there. And it's actually pretty clear, although maybe not so clear on the Zoom, but I'll read it to you. It says, to Martin, which is what they called me back then, to Martin, best wishes, and you have made a #1 poster. Tom Seaver.
There it is.
There it is. So here, I'm not a big like fanboy kind of, it sounds like it on this podcast because we're talking about my guy and he just died this year and, there's all that. So it's near and dear to my heart. And there's not, there are a lot of people you could interview me about and I would be of no help, but Tom Seaver is clearly my guy. And at the end of that, after he signed this, and I just, again, didn't want to relinquish my place in line. So last part of this long story is before leaving, I kind of, I'm like way down here, he's way up there. And I just motioned him down and he leaned over and I whispered in his ear these immortal words. When I grow up, I want to be just like you. Now, it obviously didn't quite happen that way. My own pitching career did not get farther than about 10th grade. And I was shipped off to the outfield. And, that was the end of my playing days was high school baseball. But nevertheless, the Seaver memory is near and dear. And, is clearly my favorite player of all time.
What a story.
Yeah, that's definitely the best personal story we've had here in
Real
89
quick,
episodes.
real quick, I wanted to just very briefly, like, what was the scene like in New York baseball fandom, like around the early '60s, when it was kind of just the Yankees and the Mets were this very up and coming team, and how much did the culture around it really change once Seaver came up, because he was contributing to the team very, very immediately in his career.
Yeah, and so he came up in '67, and so in the early '60s, the Yankees were still good, right? Still like Mantle Maris and some World Series appearances, but by later in the '60s, the Yankees were not very good, and the Mets briefly. I mean, most of the Mets' entire existence, they've been in the shadow of the Yankees, and the Yankees have been, historically the more prominent team, the better team, almost every year. But certainly, there was this brief period when the Yankees were sort of in a lull, and the Mets during the Seaver years of '67, as I said, he arrived. '69 they won the championship. They were very good the next few years. They got back to the World Series in '73. Should have won. They lost in 7 games to the A's. They were, and so I think that the New York baseball world, I mean, the Mets were really the darlings of it briefly. But then obviously that shifted. Seaver was traded off to the Reds, a day that I remember with Gall. And, the Yankees reemerged, and George Steinbrenner came in and began loading up, those players, the Reggie Jackson and Catfish Hunter and that whole crew. And the Yankees again became, the dominant team in New York.
And yeah, we go from sort of the highs of, Seaver with the Mets to the lows, but something I found interesting in my research of Tom Seaver was the falling out with Tom Seaver and the Mets, because, it actually kind of ties into, us being, journalism students, and, Seaver and the team president were having a bad relationship. Seaver wanted more money. He ended up getting a contract that he did not enjoy. And then at some point, the team president and this writer by the name of Dick Young in the Daily News starts to, there starts to be some parallel opinions between him and the team president. And he basically dedicates a column to bashing, the Mets darling Tom Seaver, for whatever motive. What was kind of the, was it very public, not like very public in, sort of the war of like Dick Young and the Mets team president against Tom Seaver? Was that like an ongoing thing during 1977?
Yeah, I think it was. And it's, I was sort of, by that point I was like 16, I guess. And so I was certainly still following it and still a Mets fan, and remember being devastated when they dealt Seaver away, and certainly have read about it subsequently. But, it's, I have to say this, fantastic research on your part, Chris, because you have recreated it exactly as it happened. And so there was this sort of alliance between this prominent sports writer, Dick Young, who really, sort of allied with Don Grant, I think the guy's name was they just really turned on Seaver, and that was something that was galling, and I think it just didn't work. I think it poisoned the relationship with the fan base for many years to come. It was not, I think it didn't really regenerate until the mid '80s, as the whole Dwight Gooden, Darryl Strawberry era, and that wild team that won it all in '86. That's another story altogether. With '86, interestingly enough, was Seaver's last year, and he was with the Red Sox, where the Mets played in the World Series and almost played against the Mets. But yeah, that was a very, it was a bad ending. And then they tried to right the ship years later. They brought Seaver back. And that would have been, I think, in '83.
Yep.
And so in '83, when Seaver was, definitely on the back end of his career, but they brought him back, and the thought was he was going to finish his career with the Mets, and that was a nice like healing. And I remember I did go, that was my senior year of college, and with a good friend of mine, John Chatenover, with whom I have a big Mets history. We were both students at Wesleyan University in Connecticut and got tickets to go to opening day and saw Seaver pitch against the Phillies, strike out Pete Rose, who was then with the Phillies, to start the game, and Mets won. And it seemed like it was going to have a really good ending with the Mets and Seaver, but again, the Mets sort of blew it and did not protect him, I think, and the White Sox picked him up in a free agency thing. He spent a couple of years there and then won with the Red Sox. So the Mets ultimately, I mean, their management, I think, botched this. I think Seaver is, even with my obvious deep alliance to him, coloring my view to a significant degree. I think you could say almost any fan would tell you, any baseball historian would tell you, like, who's the greatest Met of them all? It's Tom Seaver. I mean, he just clearly was the defining part of the franchise. He was, a combination of, just a tremendously talented, very bright, hugely competitive, had this great, ridiculous laugh that was so fun to listen to in interviews because he had this sort of like boyish love of things. And there's just something so appealing about the way that he went about his business. And you want, the word hero is a word that we don't even say very much anymore because it seems almost naive. I think we've come to realize that everybody has their flaws, that are, the people that we look up to, will disappoint us at times. And so we've, adopted phrases like a role model instead of a hero because it seems so naive. But Seaver to me really was a hero. And I kind of really carried that through, honestly, even beyond his career. I remember there's a funny story that I can share with you from when Seaver was inducted in the Baseball Hall of Fame. So, and you guys have the research there. So what year was that? I'm trying to recall the.
92.
I remember up until Ken Griffey Jr., Tom Seaver had the highest voting percentage.
Right.
I believe it was 98.3, I think.
That's very, very high percentage. That's correct.
98.8 in 1992.
92. Okay. So let's talk about that. So this is still like ancient history for you guys, 1992. So before you're around here, but you guys are, I just have to say again, you guys are awesome. I just love your passion for what you're doing here and your clear knowledge of baseball. Your love of it is so clear. What you've done in this podcast is just great, and really proud of what you guys are doing. I think it's tremendous.
Thank you.
So yeah, Seaver in the Hall of Fame. So 92. So I am at that point in my life. I am now 31 years old, and I am a sports writer for a local newspaper here in Western Massachusetts, the Daily Hampshire Gazette. And I'm mostly covering, local things. I'm covering high school sports, a little bit of college sports. I was just getting the UMass basketball beat, which was so exciting because they were about to really soar under John Calipari. But I'm mostly, I'm covering stuff that's local. And I know that Seaver's being inducted into the Hall of Fame, and that's in Cooperstown. That's 3.5 hours away or so. And
Hour away from me.
Was that?
Hour away from me.
Hour away from you, so that's a good location, and it's a great place to be. And actually a very good down the road, a really good internship for you guys to consider. The Hall of Fame is a really good internship, and one that you guys might look at during. So it's a paid internship, very competitive, but I think you each should go for it. I just needed to be there for this induction. I wanted to cover it. And so I knew that my newspaper, a small newspaper, was not going to, it wasn't a local story for a paper in Northampton, Mass. But I said, look, I'll, you don't have to pay me for this. I just want to write this story. And so my friend John Chatenover, who had, we'd gone to this Seaver's return, and we had gone actually to Game 6 of the '86 World Series, the famed Bill Buckner, Mookie Wilson game. And we convene again in Cooperstown in 1992. Now, it's also an interesting moment in newspaper history because back then, the Daily Hampshire Gazette was one of the last of a dying breed of what were called afternoon newspapers that printed at like noon or so. And as opposed to what most newspapers were becoming, and now almost every newspaper is a morning newspaper that's just available early in the morning. What did that mean? As a writer, it meant that if you really wanted to, you could stay up really late to work, tinker on a story. And you guys know me that I kind of like writing, and I want stories to be good. And I certainly wanted this story to be good because I was getting to write about my hero. And so I go to the induction, I hear Seaver's speech, and John Chattonover and I we couldn't stay at the main hotel there. It's called the Otesaga. It's really expensive, main media hotel. So we were way out. It's like some bed and breakfast, like 30 miles out from Cooperstown, probably closer to your home, Daniel. And, but I stayed up, I don't know, like 3:30 in the morning or something, just really crafting the story. Also, I was doing it, most of the newspaper coverage that I did at that point, I would go into the office and type on their desktop computers. I didn't think I even had my own laptop computer, but I used one of the office's ones. And it was this ancient model, and you can Google this, the Radio Shack TRS-80. And the Radio Shack TRS-80 had this little screen about maybe 1.5 inches above the keyboard, so you could only see about 5 or 6 lines of type. And the way that you sent stories back then is that you didn't email stories as you would now, or text stories, or even fax stories. You used these things that were called couplers. And what couplers were, like these big, like suction cup things that attached to the phone line, and you sent it over the phone line, kind of like a fax, I guess. I hadn't really done this because I always typed at the office. All right, so I'm up till 3:30 or 4 in the morning. I sleep maybe 2 or 3 hours, and then I go in to Cooperstown to the main media hotel, the Otesaga. And I go to the press room there, where I thought I would just send the story. I felt really good about the story. I go in there and nobody's up because they were all sending their story the night before, morning papers. Nobody's there to help me. I tried to arrange things off the phone. It wasn't working. I asked at the main desk. They didn't know. But I still have a few hours. Story's not due till like 10 in the morning. And I just, thought I just had to find a phone, and I would start walking around Cooperstown a little bit. And I think it was like to some other little mini hotel, and I convinced someone to let me use the phone there, and I set up these couplers and put it into the Radio Shack TRS-80 and pressed the button, and it's giving all these little beeps, and it's not sending. Clock is ticking. 8:30, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock deadline, 9:15, I go to another place, try to send it, it's not working. I'm panicked. Thought, oh no, I've done all this for this story on Tom Seaver. And so I called my editor, Jim Degno. I said, Jim, I can't get this to send. What should I do? And he said, you've got some time. I tell you what, why don't you just dictate it to the secretary? You have time. She can do it, and we'll just get it in. Whew. So I'm relieved. So I am dictating this story very, very slowly. I am spelling out any word that I think could conceivably be misspelled. Get through the story. I have her read it back to me. It sounds good. I feel incredibly relieved. There's at this stage, 1992, it's still, I can't look up the story online yet. That's still a few years away. I drive home, had this great experience. I'm feeling good about it. I'm very underslept, but I go into the office to pick up copies of the newspaper to see this column that I wrote about my hero, Tom Seaver. And what do I see? I see that the 2 descriptions that I use in 1969 of Tom Seaver winning the Cy Young Award, and then of him being a 3-time Cy Young Award winner, I see the spelling of Cy Young as S-Y Young. I see your head drop, Chris, because you understand what this is like as a journalist. Because let's face it, if you have one mention of Cy Young where it's misspelled, you could think typo, right? You'd be maybe forgiving of the writer that like, oh, that's too bad. Bad keystroke, pretty good story. But two identical misspellings of Cy Young, and anyone reading this is going to be thinking, this guy doesn't know jack about baseball, right? It just so invalidated the whole thing. So that's my Seaver Hall of Fame story. But all that said, admired the guy, respected the guy, was so saddened when, read about his dementia. And then, when he passed, during this terrible year of loss, 2020, that was a very, very hard loss. But great player, great person, and a very important person to me.
Yeah, that's got to be pretty terrible when you have obviously extensive knowledge about a guy, but two mistakes might have just discredited all of that to a broad audience.
You spelled 50% of the letters wrong in Cy.
Yeah, it's just was just not a good feeling because as I said to you guys back in intro to journalism class that obviously mistakes happen in journalism, but we really want to minimize them and we want to always check out the spellings of names. I think I said to you guys like one of the first days in journalism, like even if somebody tells you that their name is Joe Smith, like 999 times out of 1,000, that's going to be JOESMITH. But one time out of 1,000, it might be JO or it might be SMYTHE. And that one time, maybe that's, like the guy's grandmother is dying. This is, she really wants to see the story about her grandson in the paper, and you're the guy who spelled it wrong. So, yeah, those misspelled Cy Youngs will live with me always.
It happens like. I'm writing for a blog right now, and I've seen plenty of names spelled. I had a friend of mine wrote a Hall of Fame ballot, and Roger Clemens was spelled CLEMONS.
Ooh, yep.
I was like, no, that's not how it's spelled.
Yeah.
Like 4 different times.
So we would like to thank you very much for giving us your personal experience with the great Tom Terrific. It's a pleasure that you're the first guest of the history series. We usually do it alone, but we figured we had to. You're the biggest Tom Seaver fan we know, so a pleasure, and thank you for being on the program.
Guys, the pleasure was mine. It's as I mentioned, I really respect and applaud you for what you're doing. I think it's a terrific podcast, and really look forward to hearing further episodes down the road.
And that was the interview, or the segment. I don't know if he'd call it an interview, but he did give most of the substance.
He might be like the human baseball reference for the 1969 Mets, and just for Tom Seaver's entire career. Like when he was going into that, like some of the details of that game 4, I was on Baseball Reference. Every single detail he had off the top of his head, correct.
Yeah, and he like off the top of his head remembered like there was the almost perfect game, which is July 8th or 9th. It was July 9th. Yeah, he completely, and yeah, he talked about how like, he was facing the Braves, a team that he had admired growing up. Like all the stuff that, I had to go to, Society for American Baseball Research.
Society for American Baseball Research. We learned this week. We've been saying it wrong the whole time. I was like, well, we got to go back and redo every player history episode.
Yes, I have to re-record and be like, Society for American Baseball Research.
They threw us a curveball there.
Yeah, I mean, like 99 times out of 100, that's like it's of, but
yeah,
I've never heard the for the acronym. But yeah, just that was a great conversation we had.
It was
with Mr. Marty Dobrow, and we probably got a little more into his career. But now we get into the prime of Tom Seaver's career, where he's becoming the best. He's clearly becoming the best pitcher in baseball. This is a 6-year span from 1970 to 1975, where he's leading the league in strikeouts and wins above replacement. Strikeouts per nine. He's really ramping up the strikeouts. You can really tell, and his FIP's going down and all that. He's really becoming more dominant in this era.
So on April 22nd of 1970, Tom Seaver pitched a 2-hit complete game with 19 strikeouts and 2 walks. And this remains one of just 2 games in the history of game logs that goes since 1901 with 19 plus strikeouts, less than 3 hits allowed, and less than 3 walks. The other one, Kerry Wood's 20 strikeout game in 1998. And on May 15th, just less than a month later, he threw a 1-hit, 15 strikeout shutout with 3 walks. And he ended up finishing 4th in innings pitched on the season with 290 2/3, 2nd in fielding independent pitching with a 2.53, and he led the league in strikeouts with 283, Ks per 9 with 8.8, ERA with a 2.82, and ERA plus with a 1.43. This gave him 5th in B WAR and 3rd in F WAR. It also gave him 7th in the Cy Young vote and 29th in the MVP vote. This remains the only season by a pitcher in their first 4 seasons career-wise with 280 plus strikeouts and less than 250 hits allowed, as well as less than 85 walks. It is also the only season by a pitcher in their first 4 seasons with 290 plus innings pitched, 8.7 plus strikeouts per 9. The Mets went 83-79 this season, over 500, but not enough as they finished 3rd in the National League East.
Later on an 83-79 record becomes respectable in the National League East, but not in 1970. But as we go on with Tom Seaver, 1971, this is sort of his feature season, but it gets kind of muddled down by a man who we've also covered in the history series. So in 1971, and I guess the argument could be 71 or 73, which was better, but this is one of his great seasons. Seaver, through August 1st of 1971, had a very good 2.26 ERA through 179 1/3 innings pitched. That's spectacular, but not that spectacular when you compare it to his final 12 starts, where he completed 10 of those 12 starts and put up a 0.93 ERA. And Seaver ended up finishing 3rd in innings pitched with 286 1/3 innings pitched, and he led the league in strikeouts with 289, WHIP with a 0.95, strikeouts per 9 with 9.1, FIP with a 1.93, ERA with a 1.76, and ERA plus with a 194. And Seaver also led the league in B WAR and finished 2nd in F WAR. And he ended up finishing 2nd in the Cy Young vote and 9th in the MVP vote. And in this 1971 season, he had 5 games with a game score of 90 or better, which is tied with Nolan Ryan's 1989 and Sandy Koufax's 1965 for the most such games in a season. And it is also the only season in the live ball era with 280 plus strikeouts, an ERA of less than 1.8, and a FIP of less than 2. It is also the only season in baseball history with 280 plus strikeouts, 210 or fewer hits allowed, less than 70 walks, and 20 plus complete games. And his 1971 is also the only season in baseball history with 280 plus innings pitched, 9 plus strikeouts per 9, and an ERA plus of 190 or better. And the Mets once again went 83-79 and once again finished 3rd in the National League East.
As a team, such a mirror season from what they saw before in 1970.
Yeah, pretty wild.
So now we go into 1972, not as eventful, but still very efficient. He put up a 2.92 ERA, a 2.58 FIP, and a 1.15 ERA plus in 262 innings pitched. This gave him 7th in innings pitched and 6th in FIP. He led the league in strikeouts per 9 with 8.6, and he got 7th in B-WAR and 5th in F-WAR. And he finished 5th in the Cy Young vote, 25th in the MVP vote, but unfortunately the Mets went 83-73. They played a few less games, and they finished 3rd in the National League East.
Yeah, a weird strike that took away 8 games from.
Yeah, that's right, the 72 strike, the forgotten one.
Yeah, just a little mini strike, and yeah, that's if you're ever wondering why some teams only played 154 games in 1972, there was just a little baby strike. Who knows what could have happened with those extra 8 games? But Mets win 83 games for their 3rd consecutive season anyway. And now we go on to 1973, where the Mets actually kind of were on par with what they were doing, but the rest of the National League East was not on par with what they were doing. So Seaver himself in 1973 finished 3rd in innings pitched with 290, and that was one of the only categories where he didn't lead the league. He led the league in complete games with 18, hits per 9 with 6.8, strikeouts with 251, whip with a 0.98, strikeouts per 9 with a 7.8, strikeout to walk ratio with a 3.9, FIP with a 2.57, ERA with a 2.08, and ERA plus with a 175. And that resulted in him leading the league in both B-WAR and F-WAR. And this resulted in him winning his 2nd ever Cy Young and finishing 8th in the MVP vote. And Seaver's 3 seasons with 250 plus innings pitched, 6.5 plus strikeouts per 9, and an ERA plus of 165 or better, up to this point, remained the most by a pitcher through their first 7 seasons. And Seaver is also the only pitcher in the live ball era to have 250 plus innings pitched and an ERA plus of 115 or better in each of his first 7 seasons. And his 51.8 career B-WAR up to this point remains the most by a pitcher in the live ball era in their first 7 seasons. And the Mets, like we were saying, they went 82-79, but with a crazy turn of events, they were able to win the National League East and move on to their 2nd postseason appearance. And in Game 1 of the NLCS, with 1 man on and 2 men out in the 2nd inning, Tom Seaver looked to provide some help for himself.
Eddie Yost, the walking man when he was with the Washington Senators, coaching at 3rd. Roy McMillan, a brilliant defensive infielder, is coaching at 1st. Texas boy. There's a fly ball. That may drop in. It does. It's going to the fence. It's going to score Bud Harrelson. And the Mets take the lead 1-0 on Tom Seaver's double to left center.
Appeared to be a breaking ball that hung high and inside. Seaver just tomahawked it. A big bad pitch out of the strike zone, and with the speed that Harrelson has and a good jump off first, he scored.
So the bottom of the order hurt Bellingham. He walked the number 8 batter with 2 down, nobody on, and then gave up a double to Tom Seaver.
So Tom Seaver gets in on the offensive action and gets himself a nice playoff RBI to put the Mets on top. And Seaver also, he needed to provide offense for himself because he was facing a very tall task with the Big Red Machine, as you will see.
Inning. Geronimo is the 10th strikeout victim for Tom Seaver. 1 ball, 2 strikes. Strike three, 11 strikeouts for Seaver. When you're ahead of the hitter with the stuff Seaver has, you're in command. The 3-2 delivery. Struck him out on an outside fastball, a foul tip. That's strikeout 12 for Tom Seaver. The 2-2 pitch. Struck him out, a foul tip on a sharp curve. Strikeout number 13 for Tom Seaver.
So Tom Seaver, you know, he doesn't seem to have much of a problem with the Big Red Machine and their lineup. He strikes out 13 batters. So he shut out the Reds for 7 innings, but he allowed a game-tying home run to Pete Rose in the 8th, and then a walk-off home run to Johnny Bench in the 9th. He ended up with only 2 runs allowed, 13 strikeouts and no walks in 8 1/3 innings pitched in a 2-1 loss, a loss in which he also drove in the only run for the Mets. So some bad luck for Tom Seaver, as he was the only offensive provider, and he lost a game in which he only allowed 2 runs in 8 1/3 innings pitched. But the rest of the team was able to rally around that, and the Mets won games 2 and 3, but they lost game 4, leaving it up to a winner-take-all game in game 5. And in that game 5, Tom Seaver took the ball, and he allowed 2 runs, only one of them being earned, in 8 1/3 innings pitched, and got the win in a 7-2 victory, which sent the Mets to the World Series once again. And Seaver got the ball in game 3 of that World Series, and he got the ball with the series tied, and that's where he allowed 2 runs in 8 innings pitched and struck out 12 while only walking 1. And he got the no decision after that fantastic performance, while the Mets lost 3-2 to the Athletics. So now the Mets were down 2-1 in the series. And with that performance, with that Game 3 World Series performance and his NLCS Game 1 performance, his 1973 postseason remains the only postseason with multiple games of 12-plus strikeouts and less than 2 walks. Only guy to ever do that. Only guy to ever have that level of punch-outs and walk prevention. But luckily for the Mets and Tom Seaver, the Mets won games 4 and 5. And in game 6, with an opportunity to clinch, Seaver allowed 2 runs in 7 innings, but unfortunately, with his luck this postseason, he got the loss in a 3-1 defeat. And the Mets ended up losing game 7 and therefore losing the World Series. And throughout the postseason, Seaver pitched 31 2/3 innings pitched, put up a 1.99 ERA, struck out 35 batters, and only walked 8. And ultimately, his 3 games with 7+ innings pitched and less than 3 runs allowed in games where his team lost are the most such games in a single postseason. So that's sort of a stat where you need your team to disappoint you, but you know that's the amount of excellence he had in games that the team lost, unfortunately for him.
One of my favorite things just in the entire history of baseball is that the Mets won 83 games for 3 consecutive seasons, missed the playoffs in each of them. And then in 1973, they come around, win 1 less game than that, 82 and 79, go on to somehow win the division and then almost take down 2 dynasties in the playoffs.
Yeah, for sure. They beat the defending National League champions, and they came like inches away from beating the defending World Series champions all in one postseason.
The 2 teams that they faced in those playoffs ended up winning half of the World Series in that decade alone.
Yeah, that's correct. 72, 73, 74, 75, 76.
Right in a row. Yeah. And the 82 win Mets almost took both of them down.
Yeah, where Tom Seaver was maybe the only good player on that roster.
So now we move into 1974, and on May 1st, Tom Seaver pitched 12 innings, struck out 16 batters, walked 2, and allowed 3 hits and 1 run in a game where, unfortunately, the Mets eventually lost. And this is the only game in the history of game logs that goes back to 1901 with 12 plus innings pitched, 16 plus strikeouts, and less than 6 base runners. And yes, that is still a loss, unfortunately. However, lingering injuries negatively affected his performance on the field. He did end up with a 3.20 ERA, 2.91 FIP, 1.12 ERA plus, and 236 innings pitched. So his numbers were still very good, but he did have the injuries still lingering. He finished 3rd in FIP. He led the league in strikeouts per 9 with 7.7 and K to walk ratio with 2.7. He finished 4th in B-WAR and 9th in F-WAR. The Mets ended up going 71 and 91, finishing 5th in the NL East. And in September of 1974, he was diagnosed with sciatic nerve problem, and he dislocated his pelvic structure. So that was a big problem for him. And then he eventually worked with a doctor who fixed the problems, which theoretically helped him for the future. So pending these injuries, we now go into 1975, where in this season, he becomes the first pitcher in baseball history to strike out 200 plus batters in 8 consecutive seasons. And he finished 3rd in innings pitched with 280 and a third, 3rd in ERA with a 238, and 3rd in ERA plus with a 146. He led the league in wins with 22, strikeouts with 243, and FIP with a 2.35. And he led the league in both B-WAR and F-WAR, got 3rd in the Cy Young and 9th in the MVP vote. And the Mets went 82 and 80, but they didn't have the same luck as 2 seasons before. They finished 3rd in the National League East.
Yes. I do word it weird in the prep sheets, but didn't finish 3rd in the Cy Young. He won his 3rd Cy Young.
Oh, he won his 3rd Cy Young.
He did win the Cy Young while leading the league in both B-WAR and F-WAR. So that gave him a nice trio. And this caps off.
That's not bad.
That caps off an extremely dominant run by Mr. Tom Terrific. Particularly a 5-year stretch from 1971 to 1975, where he wins 2 Cy Youngs. There's an argument that he could have won 3, if you include 1971, where he led the league in ERA, FIP by a large margin. But he ended up averaging a 19 and 10 record from 1971 to 1975, 271 innings pitched, 16 complete games, 4 shutouts, 247 strikeouts, 8.0 B-WAR and 7.0 F-WAR per year in this 5-year stretch, with a 3.4 strikeout to walk ratio, 2.43 ERA, 2.45 FIP, and 144 ERA plus. And also from 1971 to 1975, he was 9th in innings pitched, 5th in wins, 2nd in strikeouts, 2nd in F-WAR, and 1st in B-WAR. And from 1971 to 1975, minimum 500 innings pitched. Seaver was 2nd in strikeouts per 9, 2nd in strikeout to walk ratio, 1st in FIP, 1st in ERA, and 1st in ERA plus. So probably definitely in terms of run prevention, the best pitcher of that 5-year stretch. And now we head into an era where he's kind of breaking away from the franchise that originally had him.
So now we go into 1976 to 77, and before the 76 season, Seaver demanded a 3-year, $825,000 contract. And the team president was angry with Seaver's demands and threatened to trade Seaver to the Dodgers for Don Sutton, but they didn't follow through because Seaver was a few months away from beginning a 10-5 player, from becoming a 10-5 player, which would essentially give him the ability to reject every trade. Because, he's played in the league for 10 years, 5 with the team, gives him a no trade clause. And also, the team thought it'd be a PR disaster to trade Seaver. Tell that to the Colorado Rockies. The Mets ended up signing Seaver to an incentive-based 3-year, $675,000 deal. And although he signed it, he wasn't happy that he was resorted to doing this. That was obviously not the pay that he wanted. But despite those actions, he ended up finishing third in innings pitched with 271, third in ERA with a 259, and fifth in ERA plus with a 126. He ended up leading the league in strikeouts with 235, Ks per nine with 7.8, and FIP with a 2.47. He finished fifth in BWAR and led the league in FWAR. He finished eighth in the Cy Young vote. And Seaver's 9 seasons with 200 plus strikeouts up to this point remain the most through a pitcher's first 10 seasons in their career. And as for the Mets, they hovered above 500, again, finishing 86 and 76, third in the National League East.
So now we are on to 1977, where there's some things looming over for the Mets and Tom Seaver. And it starts when, in spring training, Tom Seaver voiced his displeasure for the Mets not signing any of the 24 free agents on the market in the previous offseason. And he also saw that teammate Dave Kingman's contract negotiations were not going well. And Seaver openly wondered whether he should have passed up on his 3-year deal and rather just gone into free agency. And that's when the Mets president, Mr. M. Donald Grant, called Seaver an ingrate. And the contentious relationship between M. Donald Grant and Seaver became well known. And the team president formed an alliance with Daily News sports writer Dick Young, who would now just openly bash Tom Seaver in the paper. He wrote this sports writer, Dick Young, wrote things such as, quote, "Tom Terrific is a pouting, griping, morale-breaking clubhouse lawyer poisoning the team," unquote. And Seaver, so that's just the surface level for the Dick Young columns, who was siding with the team president. And with Tom Seaver, after Seaver put up a 3.58 ERA through June 1st, he threw 2 complete game victories with 1 run allowed combined in what were evidently his final 2 starts before the June 15th trade deadline. So before this deadline, he throws 2 complete game victories and ups his stock and makes the Mets probably want him a little more, with these 2 complete game victories. And after the second of those 2 complete games, the Mets offered Seaver a 3-year, $1 million extension that would run from 1979 to 1981. This would take care of him through his late 30s. And one day before the trade deadline, Seaver told the Mets GM to stop trade talks with the Reds, and it seemed that Seaver was going to agree to this extension. But apparently soon after, Seaver read Dick Young's Daily News column, which said, quote, Nolan Ryan is getting more now than Seaver, and that galls Tom because Nancy Seaver and Ruth Ryan are very friendly, and Tom Seaver long has treated Nolan Ryan like a little brother. So Seaver felt this was a very personal attack and was a little intrusive, and Seaver, knowing that Young's columns had heavy influence from Mets team president, this was the final straw for Seaver with the Mets. And he told the Mets public relations director, quote, "Get me out of here." And he told the Mets GM that everything Seaver said the previous night regarding trade talks was forgotten. Like, he mentioned that he said that, stop trade talks with Cincinnati. We're going to get a deal done. But after this column, this is no longer the case. And in turn, after he called off the calling off, Seaver was traded to the Cincinnati Reds for Doug Flynn, Steve Henderson, Dan Norman, and Pat Zachary. And despite Seaver wanting this trade, it was still hard for him to sort of deal with this.
Cincinnati, as far as the fans go, I mean, I've given them a great number of thrills, and they've been equally returned. And the ovation I got the other night.
Would Seaver miss the fans would miss him. And the same could be said of Dave Kingman, who was also traded the same night. It was an emotional transformation, and June 15th, 1977 will forever be remembered as the Midnight Massacre.
Come on, George.
So Tom Seaver, obviously emotional about his exit. It did not go the way he wanted it to go. And he probably, if the relationship was good, probably wanted to be a Met for life, but he couldn't take it anymore. So now we get into the era of Tom Seaver's career where he's a respectable Red. He still has the skills that made him succeed in New York, but now he's doing it in a different uniform. So in his first start with Cincinnati, Seaver threw a 3-hit shutout with 8 strikeouts and no walks. And in 165 and a third innings pitched with the Reds in 1977, Seaver put up a 2.34 ERA, 2.87 FIP, and 168 ERA plus. And he ended up finishing 5th in the National League in innings pitched with 261 and a third, 2nd in FIP with a 2.94, 2nd in ERA with a 2.58, and 4th in ERA plus with a 149. And Seaver ended up leading the league in shutouts with 7, hits per 9 with 6.9, whip with a 1.01, and strikeout to walk ratio with a 3.0. And Seaver ended up finishing 3rd in B WAR and 3rd in F WAR. And the writers paid close attention to these sabermetrics as they had him finish 3rd in the Cy Young vote and also 25th in the MVP vote. And the Reds went 88 and 74 and finished 2nd in the National League West. And Seaver remains the only pitcher in baseball history to have 5+ Baseball Reference WAR in each of his first 11 seasons. And Seaver's 79.1 career B WAR up to this point remained the most by a pitcher in the live ball era through their first 11 seasons. So Seaver obviously was spectacular to start off his career, one of the quickest starts to a career that we had ever seen.
So now we go to 1978, his first full season with Cincinnati, and on June 16th, he was looking to earn his 4th complete game of the season.
Now a strike away from his first major league no-hitter. The Reds leading at 4-0 in the 9th inning. Hendrick puts a head of the bat on the plate. Werner hangs a sign. Seaver with a pause, the check and the pitch. He bounces to first base. Dreesen has it. He goes to the bag, and Seaver's got it. Tom Seaver has pitched his first major league no-hitter, and this one belongs to the Reds. Seaver is being mobbed at first base as George Hendrick bounces a routine 2-hopper to Danny Dreesen, and the 38,216 at Riverfront Stadium are standing. Tom Seaver has thrown the first no-hitter of his major league career, the 14th no-hitter in the long history of the Cincinnati Reds, and he did it in almost routine fashion tonight, and what a ball game.
So Tom Seaver throws his first career no-hitter. The young, at the time, Marty Brenneman on the call for that one. And on the season, Tom Seaver ended with a 2.88 ERA, a 3.17 FIP, and a 1.23 ERA plus in 259 and two-thirds innings pitched. This gave him 6th in innings pitched, 10th in ERA, and 8th in ERA plus. He also finished 10th in B-WAR and 9th in F-WAR. The Reds ended up going 92 and 69, but unfortunately, they finished second in the NL West. And to this day, Seaver remains the only pitcher in baseball history to have 170 plus strikeouts and less than 90 walks in each of their first 12 seasons. He also remains the only pitcher in baseball history to have 230 plus innings pitched and an ERA of 1.10 or better, and 6 plus strikeouts per nine in each of their first 12 seasons, and no one else has more than 8 such seasons in their first 12 seasons. So now we go to 1979, where Tom Seaver looks to close out another decade.
So Tom Seaver, through his first 10 starts, went 2-5 with a 5.44 ERA. So it was very uncharacteristic. And in his next and final 22 starts, he went 14-1 with a 2.42 ERA in 163 and two-thirds innings pitched. And his performance helped the Reds win the National League West by 1.5 games. And Seaver ended up finishing 7th in FIP with a 3.33, 10th in ERA with a 3.14, and 9th in ERA plus with a 1.21. And this was all these read statistics ranked in the top 10 while he threw a career low. This is not a big deal considering how many innings he pitched. 215 innings pitched was a career low for him in his 13th season. And Seaver led the league in shutouts with 5, and he ended up finishing 9th in F4, and he finished 4th in the Cy Young vote and 21st in the MVP vote. So now on to the postseason, where the Reds belong in after winning that National League West by a 1.5 games. Seaver, in Game 1 of the NLCS, allowed 2 runs in 8 innings, and of course got the no decision as the Reds lost 5-2 to the Pirates. And the Reds ended up getting swept in this series. And this was Seaver's last time pitching in the postseason. So to recap his postseason career, it was pretty excellent. He put up a career 2.77 postseason ERA and 3.2 strikeout to walk ratio in 61 and two-thirds innings pitch. And a strikeout to walk ratio above 3 in the 70s is a much bigger deal than it is now. And also from his third career postseason start on, he posted a 1.81 ERA and 3.8 strikeout to walk ratio in 49 and two-thirds innings pitched. So he did struggle at the start, but in his final 6 postseason starts, he was on another level.
So now we move into a new decade, the 1980s, and this one wouldn't be as kind to Tom Seaver, as he had some bad luck, also some bad performances. In the 1980 season, he missed a lot of July, the entire month of July, in fact, because of arm trouble. And he wasn't performing as characteristically well as we were used to. He had an ERA above 5 as late as August 9th. But in his final 8 starts, he was able to turn it around. He put up a 1.64 ERA in 66 innings pitched. He ended up that season with a 3.64 ERA, a 4.48 FIP, a 99 ERA plus in 168 innings pitched in total. So he did just barely qualify despite missing the month. But overall, not the best season for Seaver, and he would look to come back from that in 1981. Now, on April 18th, Seaver struck out his 3,000th batter, which garnered enough national attention to get 6 seconds of airtime on the MLB Network Remembers that aired just a little over a month ago.
Just 11 days before Carlton did it, Tom Seaver got his 3,000th career strikeout. So April 1980.
And there it is.
Tom Seaver. That's the only known video of it that we were able to get, but we'll take it.
Yep.
And on June 11th, he threw his 5th complete game, allowing 2 runs and striking out 7, as well as walking 1 to earn the win, lowering his ERA to 2.06 on the season. And this pulled the Reds within a half a game lead of the National League West. And then the next day, the players went on strike, and the league did not return the regular season until August 10th, just 2 months later. And after getting a loss on August 12th, Seaver went 7-0 with a 2.49 ERA. So he had a dominant season in 1981. But unfortunately, because of the way the league worked in a strike season, the Reds went 31-21 in the second half, and with their first half compiled the best record in baseball, which is great. But the way it worked was that the best record in each division in the first half and the best record in each division in the second half are the teams that went to the playoffs, no matter what your combined record was. And the Houston Astros came out of absolutely nowhere and ended up having a great second half, beating the Reds. So they didn't make the playoffs, unfortunately. Seaver ended up with a 2.54 ERA, a 3.58 FIP, and 140 ERA plus in 166 and a third innings pitched. This team, man, like, they were absolutely screwed. Like, I wrote about this about a month or so ago, and it reminded me of like when UCF football went undefeated, but they were upset over not having a chance to compete in the national championship tourney. This could be worse.
Yeah, I mean, like, it's terrible also because it gave the first half winners no incentive to
Exactly
compete in the second half.
Like the Dodgers were just like running on fumes for 2.5 months.
Yeah, they could just chill out for the most part, have plenty
They
of planned off
sit
days.
the entire roster for 2 months.
Yeah, exactly. It was real weird, like pretty weird how it all happened.
Yeah. That was such a weird decision that I will never understand. Anyway, Tom Seaver finished 4th in innings pitched, 8th in ERA, and 6th in ERA plus. He led the league in wins with 14 and a winning percentage with an 875. He finished 5th in BWAR, and he finished 2nd in the Cy Young vote, along with 10th in the MVP vote.
And now we're on to probably Tom Seaver's worst season, 1982. He had an extremely uncharacteristic season with a 5.50 ERA, 4.50 FIP, and 67 ERA plus, and also 11.0 hits per 9 in 111 and a third innings pitched. And his final appearance of the season came on August 15th, so either an injury happened or they just did not want him pitching for the remainder of the season. And in this season, the Reds went 61 and 101 for the worst record in the National League. And with the Mets looking to increase ticket sales, they traded Jason Felice, Charlie Palaio, and Lloyd McClendon for Tom Seaver. So now we head into the late stage of Tom Seaver's career, where he's not, winning Cy Youngs or anything, but he's still producing. He's still producing at an above average level throughout the rest of his career.
So now he's back on the Mets in 1983. So in 1983, Tom Seaver had a bit of a resurgence. He threw his most amount of innings in a single season since 1978 with 231. This gave him 10th in the NL, and he put up a 3.55 ERA, a 3.77 FIP, and a 103 ERA plus. The Mets, however, went 68 and 94, finishing last in the NL East. And because of the strike, there were some unorthodox rules that were put in place that offseason. This is from Society for American Baseball Research, where they say, the resolution of the 1981 players' strike established an annual pool of players from which teams could select players as compensation for free agent losses. With several young prospects they were anxious to keep, the Mets did not envision a team that would want Tom Seaver, who is now 39. Whose value was higher in New York because of his appeal as an attendance draw. And the White Sox ended selecting ended up selecting Tom Seaver through this system, which is kind of funny because Tom Seaver's Mets career began through a lottery and it is now ending through an unorthodox system.
Yeah, exactly.
Full circle. So now going into 1984, quite an uneventful season. He put up a 3.95 ERA, 3.94 FIP, 105 ERA plus, and 236 and 2/3 innings pitched. Fairly good season, especially considering his age. The White Sox, however, went 74 and 88, and they finished 5th in the AL West.
Oh, right. The AL West.
Yeah. I was going to say the AL Central didn't exist in 1984.
That's a whoopsie. Hate to do that to you.
I mean, shout out to me for catching that with it right on the paper. I could have just read that.
Yeah. I've given it. I guess I kind of faded out towards the end of this.
That was just a test. I see that.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
You gave me that's part of the script for a reason.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And also when I said NL Central for 1968.
Oh God, yeah. I didn't even pick up on that.
It was all part of the plan. I just, got to keep you on your toes.
Yeah.
But as we head into the last couple years of Tom Seaver's career, 1985 was a very good season for him. And on August 4th, with a 4-1 lead against the Yankees with 2 men on and 2 men out in the bottom of the 9th, Tom Seaver was looking to earn his 5th complete game of the year.
This crowd is on its feet to an extent, as Don Baylor will step in to pinch hit for Bobby Meacham. A single by Pascal. Randolph was robbed by Bain for the second out, and then a walk to Pagliarulo, and there is former President Richard Nixon on his feet in the Yankee owner's box.
Seaver is ready to work now to Don Baylor, and it's a high fly ball. It should be playable. Nichols is moving over. Nichols is there. The ball game is over. Seaver has won 300. He has become the 17th man in the history of baseball to win 300 games. Seaver will turn it loose now. A 40-year-old Terrific Tom Seaver. Look at the emotion spilling out all over.
So couple things there throughout that video. First of all, shout out to Don Baylor, the last out of that 300th win, for being the all-time hit by pitch king before Craig Biggio took it over in 2005. Second of all, shout out to Mike Pagliarulo, known 1991 twin, for getting a little shout out in there.
Right, yeah, Mike Pagliarulo, World Series champion in 1991. Yeah, I forgot how great that name was.
I remember how much trouble you had pronouncing it because it had a G in it.
There's a silent G, yeah.
Yeah,
it's tough.
They always get you with those silent G's.
Yeah, those Italians. Seaver, with all this, with this 300th win on the 1985 season, had a very good season. A 3.17 ERA, 3.73 FIP, and 136 ERA plus in 283 and 2/3 innings pitched. This is in his age 40 season. He's putting up 238 innings pitched, 136 ERA plus. And Seaver, in fact, finished 6th in ERA and 5th in ERA plus, and he also finished 8th in Baseball Reference 4. And it is the only season by a pitcher in their age 40 season or older with 230 plus innings pitched, an ERA plus of 130 or better, 5+ strikeouts per 9, and 5+ complete games. And the White Sox ended up going 85 and 77 and finishing 3rd in the AL West. I guess I got it right that time.
You did.
Yeah, I guess it was just one little mistake.
No, you were just, I'm telling you, you were just testing me.
Yeah, you know what? Subconsciously, that's exactly what I was doing.
Yeah.
And Now on to 1986, where in 12 starts with the White Sox, Seaver put up a 4.38 ERA, 4.87 FIP, and 100 ERA plus, and 72 innings pitched. And with the White Sox out of the race, and Seaver wanting to be closer to his home and his family in Connecticut, Seaver ended up asking to be traded to a New York or Boston team to get closer to that Connecticut family and home. And on June 29th, he was traded to the Boston Red Sox for Steve Lyons, who now has a broadcasting position at the New England Sports Network. And Seaver ended up throwing 104 and a third innings pitched for the Red Sox and put up a 3.80 ERA, 3.28 FIP, and 111 ERA plus. So, this is what the era is all about. Seaver's 41. He's still producing at an above average level, not prime Seaver level, but still, very, very good for a 41-year-old. And despite his above average ERA, he had a 7-13 record combined in 1986, which was probably a cause of him being left off of the Red Sox playoff roster. And Seaver actually looked to play for the Mets in 1987, but he did not prove his ability to play with the defending champions. So he ended up retiring on June 22nd of 1987.
So now we go into Tom Seaver's post-career, and in 1992, just short of a decade afterwards, he was inducted into the Hall of Fame with a 98.8% of the vote. That would be the most all-time in 1992, and it wouldn't be passed until around 25 years later in 2016 by none other than Ken Griffey Jr. His induction ceremony in Cooperstown attracted 10,000 people, which was also a record at the time. He was also the first Met ever inducted. He's only one of 2 Mets to ever be inducted currently. And from 1989 to 1993, he was a broadcaster for the Yankees. And he was a broadcaster for the Mets as well from 99 up until 2005. And after spending most of his post-career in Connecticut, he eventually moved to California and established a winery with his wife, Nancy. And in March 2019, Seaver announced that he was diagnosed with dementia, and the Mets renamed the address to Citi Field to 41 Tom Seaver Way. So they honored him with his number and his name. And unfortunately, on August 31st of 2020, he died from complications with Lewy body dementia and COVID-19. So now we're going to get into Tom Seaver's all-time ranks. He is 19th all-time in innings pitched with 4,783, 18th in career wins with 311, tied for 7th in shutouts with 61, 11th in pitcher FWAR with 92.7, 7th in pitcher BWAR with 106, and 6th in strikeouts with 3,640. He is the all-time Mets leader in innings pitched, ERA, FIP, strikeouts, wins, BWAR, and FWAR.
And now we get into the Tom Seaver edition of And now we get into what made his career so special, kind of a dedication to him. We know that his death was relatively recent, but it's kind of a celebration of Mr. Tom Seaver. So Seaver has the lowest career whip of anyone with 4,000 plus innings pitched in the live ball era with a 1.12 career whip. And his 7 seasons with 5+ shutouts are the most such seasons in the live ball era. Seaver also had 9 seasons with 250 plus innings pitched, less than 7.5 hits per 9, and less than 3 walks per 9. No one else in the live ball era has more than 5 such seasons. And Seaver had 9 of those. And Seaver's 76 career games with 9+ innings pitched, 8+ strikeouts, and less than 3 walks are the most such career games by a pitcher in the history of game logs? And Seaver's 6 seasons with 250 plus innings pitched, 6 plus strikeouts per nine, and an ERA of 140 or better are the most such seasons in baseball history. Seaver also had 10 seasons with 250 plus innings pitched, 6 strikeouts per nine, and a whip of less than 1.2. No one else in baseball history has had more than 7 such seasons. Seaver also had 11 seasons with 250 plus innings pitched, 6 plus strikeouts per nine, and an ERA of less than 3. No one else in baseball history has had more than 7 such seasons. And Seaver is also the only pitcher in baseball history with 4,500 plus hits, less than 4,000 hits allowed, and less than 1,500 walks.
Did you mean 45,000 innings pitched there? You sounded like you said 45,000 hits.
I'll just redo that. And he is the only pitcher in baseball history with 4,500 plus innings pitched, less than 4,000 hits allowed, and less than 1,500 walks. And Seaver is the only pitcher in baseball history with 4,000 plus innings pitched, less than 7.48 hits per nine, and less than 3 walks per nine. And the last one we'll get to, perhaps the most impressive one. Seaver is the only pitcher in baseball history with 3,600 plus strikeouts and an ERA of less than 3. So that is all the how about that's we have for this part of the episode. And now we go on to his legacy. Tom Seaver's legacy. What I saw is Tom Seaver did not need time to develop as a pitcher. A lot of the pitchers we cover usually have some struggles at the beginning. They sort of formulate maybe 3, 4, 5 years into their career, and then they're the pitcher that they were meant to be. Tom Seaver was excellent from the start. We talk about all those how about that's within of anyone in their first season, of anyone in their first 2 seasons, he was the only pitcher to do this. That's very meaningful, and it's impressive he was able to not only do that at such a young age. He was able to do that for a very long time as well, unlike examples would be Vita Blue, Dwight Gooden, guys who broke out early but didn't necessarily continue it. Tom Seaver broke out early and continued it. And also, it makes sense. There was a quote from him being in the minor leagues. There was a quote saying that he has a 35-year-old head and a 21-year-old body. And from his performance, his ability to come out and be a great pitcher from the start, it kind of says that. It kind of says that for you. And also, Seaver was excellent in every aspect of pitching. He ate up innings. He was able to get plenty of strikeouts, led the league in strikeouts 5 times. He led the league in ERA and ERA plus plenty of times, led the league in FIP plenty of times, strikeout to walk ratio plenty of times. He led the league in hits per nine, lowest amount of hits per nine plenty of times. He was a very complete pitcher, and could be an argument for the most complete pitcher of all time, especially relative to the time, because his career strikeouts per nine was 6.8. But, when you consider he pitched in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, that's actually quite a bit. And also what should be very noted, or what should be very notable with Tom Seaver, is in a sea of great starting pitchers in the 1970s. Some we've covered on here, Fergie Jenkins, Steve Carlton, some more would include, Bob Gibson, maybe a little before his time, but also, Bert Blyleven, Phil Niekro, Don Sutton, plenty of pitchers in, that late 60s, 1970s era. Tom Seaver is still able to come out as the best, even when starting pitching was, at its peak. He was still able to come out on top as, pretty clearly the best to do it in that era, in terms of, ERA, strikeouts, eating innings. The combination made him the best to do it in that era. And lastly, what I'll say about Tom Seaver, he is the face of New York Mets history. When you think of Mets history, you have to think of Tom Seaver. He's definitely the greatest Met of all time. He came in, while the Mets were only in their sixth season, and his legacy lives on for a very good. He was, the best to do it for their franchise, and they haven't seen many like him in that organization.
Yeah, kind of going off of that last point, Tom Seaver put the Mets on the map. That was a franchise that came from nothing, sort of. I'm sure when they were incepted, during their inception in 1962, I'm sure a lot of New York baseball fans were still bitter about losing the Dodgers, losing the Giants, where, it was just the Yankees running the town for a few years. The Mets come in and, like we mentioned in our interview with Marty, up until 1969, they hadn't finished above last place except for that one season beforehand where they finished ninth. So Tom Seaver came in. He was the first thing that Mets fans really had to be excited about for the long-term future. And, he brought them in, won a Cy Young in a miracle season. And, kind of just to back the whole point up, he was the reason the Mets were ever relevant to begin with. He was the first great Met, and he put them on the map.
Yeah, that's exactly right. He did put them on the map, and yeah, they wouldn't have won the division in '69 without him. They probably never make it to a World Series before the '80s if not for him. I mean, he was a big part in making them a respectable franchise rather than what was previously pretty much a joke of a franchise.
I mean, he was the relevance that they had.
Yeah, he was it. His first season was, when he came in, he had the best Mets season ever, and in his first ever season, and it was the Mets' sixth season. And he was 22 at the time, which is pretty crazy to think about. So yeah, I guess that does it for Tom Seaver. It was a long one. We gave you a lot of content for this one. We hope you enjoyed all of that ride, and if you would like to watch the videos with us, if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and want to watch those videos with us, go to our YouTube channel and subscribe to the YouTube channel. It is called Above Replacement Radio. If you want to follow us on social media, follow me on Twitter at Chris_Gianta, and follow Daniel on both Twitter and Instagram at Daniel_Curran, and also follow the show Instagram at Above Replacement Radio. And lastly, we would also like to thank Stathead, Baseball Reference, Fangraphs, and Society for American Baseball Research, and also MLB on YouTube for all the information and content that we needed for this episode. So we hope you enjoyed the Tom Seaver part of the episode, and we hope to see you tomorrow, where we are going to be talking about the 2007 Colorado Rockies. See you then.